Close your eyes for a moment. Just breathe. Imagine the Earth as it once was. Not as it is today, not cities, not roads, not the hum of electricity threading through walls at night, but something older, something quieter in a way, and yet so impossibly loud if you were standing in the middle of it. I want to take you there tonight. I want to walk you through a world that existed long before the first human eyes ever opened to see a sunrise. A world that ran on entirely different rules, where the ground shook not from machines but from footsteps, where the sky was sometimes orange for days on end, where the oceans were warmer, the air thicker, and the creatures living beneath it all were unlike anything you have ever seen in your waking life. This is Earth, but not the Earth you know. This is Earth during the age of the dinosaurs. And I'll be honest with you, I've spent a long time thinking about how to tell this story. Because it's not just a story about giant lizards wandering through prehistoric jungles. It's something richer than that, something stranger. There are details buried in the fossil record that most people never hear about. Clues hidden in ancient rock layers that, when you put them all together, start to tell a story with a shape to it, a narrative arc, a beginning, a long and winding middle, and an ending that, well, the ending is the part I find most fascinating of all, because there's something about the way it ended that scientists are still arguing about. Something that doesn't quite fit the simple explanation most of us were taught in school. And tonight, as we drift slowly through this ancient world together, I want to lay out all the pieces for you, one by one, very gently, so that by the time we reach the end, you'll understand why I think this is one of the greatest mysteries our planet has ever kept. But first, the beginning. If you enjoy listening to sleepy prehistoric stories like this one, go ahead and subscribe. I post stories like this every week, and there are many more worlds left to explore together. Now, let us go back. To understand the age of the dinosaurs, you have to understand what came before it. And what came before it was, in many ways, almost as strange. Let me paint you a picture, a slow, soft picture, the kind you can hold behind your eyelids as your body settles into wherever you're resting tonight. Imagine a supercontinent, one enormous landmass sitting on the face of the Earth like a single puzzle piece, surrounded on all sides by a vast, unbroken ocean. Scientists call this ancient supercontinent Pangaea, and when you see reconstructions of it in textbooks, it always looks vaguely surprising, like someone took all the familiar coastlines you know and pressed them together like clay. South America fits snugly against Africa. North America nestles against Europe. India, which you might expect to be somewhere near the middle, is tucked along the eastern side of what would eventually become Antarctica. And all of it, all of these land masses that are today separated by thousands of miles of open ocean, are touching, connected, one. This is the late Permian period, roughly 252 million years ago, and Pangaea has been stable for an extraordinarily long time. The climate across this supercontinent is harsh and varied. The interior, far from any coastline and its moisture, is deeply arid. Massive desert systems stretch across what would one day be North Africa, Europe and Central Asia. The edges, closer to the ancient ocean called Panthalassa, are more livable, humid and warm, thick with primitive forests of seed ferns and conifer-like trees that look almost recognizable but not quite. Not quite, because everything alive during this period is subtly wrong if you try to compare it to today. The insects are enormous. Some dragonflies have wingspans approaching 2 feet, a consequence of the oxygen-rich atmosphere of earlier periods. The amphibians that dominate many wetland environments are thick-bodied salamander-like creatures the size of crocodiles. And moving through the forests and open scrublands are the ancestors of mammals, animals called therapsids, which look like a peculiar halfway point between a lizard and a dog, with sprawling and semi-upright postures, and, in some cases, evidence suggesting they may have been warm-blooded. This is the world that exists before the dinosaurs. It is a world that has survived for hundreds of millions of years, changing slowly, incrementally, species rising and falling in a gentle rhythm that spans geological ages, and then, 252 million years ago, something happens, something catastrophic, the Permian-Triassic extinction event, the greatest mass extinction in the history of complex life on Earth. Scientists sometimes call it the Great Dying, and that name does not feel like an exaggeration when you look at the numbers. approximately 96% of all marine species disappear. Around 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species vanish. The coral reefs, which had been building for hundreds of millions of years, are obliterated almost entirely. The exact cause of the great dying is still debated, which I find quietly extraordinary. That something so enormous, so complete in its devastation, can still be partially mysterious after all the science we have available to us. But the leading candidate is a series of catastrophic volcanic eruptions in what is today Siberia. These eruptions, called the Siberian Traps, lasted perhaps 1 million years, which sounds long until you realise that 1 million years is a brief moment in geological time. They pumped enormous quantities of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, triggering rapid climate warming, ocean acidification, and widespread environmental collapse. The world that emerges from this catastrophe is not the same world that entered it. It is emptier, quieter, stripped of the rich ecological complexity it once had. But emptiness in nature is an invitation. Into the gaps left by the great dying's vanished creatures, new life begins to move. Slowly at first, small, cautious, opportunistic. But over the next several million years during the Triassic period that follows, something begins to happen that will reshape the history of life on Earth. The first dinosaurs appear. And here is something I want you to sit with for a moment, as you let your breathing slow and your thoughts drift soft and formless. The first dinosaurs are not impressive. They are not enormous. They do not shake the ground when they walk. The very first members of the lineage that would eventually include Tyrannosaurus rex and Brachiosaurus and Triceratops are small, quick, lightly built creatures, perhaps the size of a dog or a large cat, moving through the underbrush of early Triassic forests with the nervous energy of animals that are not yet in charge. They are at first just survivors, like everything else that made it through the great dying. And yet there is something about them, some combination of posture, metabolism and circumstance, that gives them an edge, a capability that will, over the next 185 million years, allow them to become the dominant large animals on Earth. The Triassic period, roughly 252 to 201 million years ago, is the story of this slow rise. It is not dramatic. It is not sudden. It is a gradual, patient accumulation of advantage. Each generation slightly better adapted, slightly better positioned than the last, until one day you look up and realise that the world belongs to them. I love this part of the story, personally. There's something deeply comforting about it. The idea that extraordinary things can begin as very ordinary things, that the ancestors of the most magnificent creatures to ever walk this planet were, once upon a time, just small animals trying to eat and rest and stay warm and avoid being eaten. The Triassic forests they move through are not the lush green jungles we tend to imagine when we think prehistoric. The climate, still recovering from the Permian catastrophe, is warm and relatively dry across much of Pangaea's interior. The dominant plants are seed ferns, cycads, conifers and horsetails, plants that look ancient and strange, almost alien, with their waxy leaves and bare, armoured trunks. The landscape has a quality I imagine as almost monochromatic seen from a distance, browns and greys and dusty greens. The skies are clear and hot, and the air is thin with moisture but thick with the smell of resins from the conifers, a sharp, piney scent that would have been constant. Moving through this landscape, the early dinosaurs share the world with many competitors. Other reptiles, some quite large and formidable. The early proto-mammals continuing their quiet evolution in the underbrush. This is not yet a world dominated by dinosaurs, not yet, but the clock is ticking, and the next catastrophe is coming. At the boundary between the Triassic and Jurassic periods, approximately 201 million years ago, another mass extinction occurs. Not as devastating as the Great Dying, but substantial. The Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, another enormous volcanic event, reshapes the global climate once more. Many of the dinosaurs' competitors disappear in this extinction. The large crurotarsal archosaurs, crocodile-line relatives that had been the dominant large animals in many ecosystems, are badly hit. And the dinosaurs, for reasons that science is still working to fully explain, come through relatively unscathed. They inherit the world. I think about that moment, that transition, a great deal. That quiet, unhurried passing of dominance from one lineage to another. No announcement, no single dramatic event. Just the slow realization, written in rock and bone across millions of years, that one group of animals had outlasted the others. There is something almost meditative about that timescale, the way things change so slowly that nothing alive at the time could ever perceive the change. Each generation waking up to the same world their parents woke up to, neither knowing nor caring that a transformation of unimaginable significance is taking place. Drift with that thought for a while, the world turning slowly in the dark, life finding its way. The Jurassic period begins roughly 201 million years ago, and if there is one word I would use to describe what happens during the first tens of millions of years of this new era, it is this: explosion. Not an explosion in the violent sense, though we will get to violence, don't worry, but an explosion of a life, of diversity, of sheer biological creativity. Pangaea is beginning to break apart. Slowly, always slowly, in geological time. The great supercontinent is developing rifts and fractures, splitting along ancient seams into two primary land masses. In the north, what scientists call Laurasia, the future North America, Europe and Asia. In the south, Gondwana, South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia and India, still bound together in the ancient configuration. Between these separating land masses, shallow seas begin to form. The Tethys Sea, a vast warm ocean that spreads across what will eventually become the Mediterranean and much of the Middle East, is particularly important. These shallow, warm epicontinental seas are extraordinarily productive environments, rich in marine life, in coral reefs being rebuilt from the Triasic's devastation, in the strange and wonderful creatures that colonize every available niche, and the climate. The climate during the Jurassic is, to put it simply, extraordinary. There are no polar ice caps. The poles are cold by Jurassic standards, meaning perhaps 10 degrees Celsius, rather than the subtropical warmth of the tropics, but not frozen. The oceans circulate heat more evenly than they do today, distributing warmth from the equator toward the higher latitudes and preventing the dramatic temperature gradients we take for granted in our own time. The atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration is estimated at roughly 4 to 8 times higher than pre-industrial modern levels. This creates a powerful greenhouse effect, trapping heat, warming the oceans, and producing the dense, lush, warm, moist climate that we picture when we imagine the Jurassic. The dense fern prairies and cycad thickets, the enormous conifer forests, the vast, spreading canopies of tree ferns reaching toward a sky that, on clear days, is deep and impossibly blue. It is, in a very real sense, a greenhouse world. And greenhouse worlds are enormously productive ones. Into this warm, lush, food-rich environment, the dinosaurs grow, and they grow large. The sauropods, the long-necked, long-tailed herbivores that remain the largest land animals in the history of Earth, reach their greatest expressions during the Jurassic. I want to take a moment here because I think we've all seen pictures of these animals so many times that we've become somewhat numb to how genuinely astonishing they are. Consider Diplodocus. A fully grown Diplodocus might reach 85 feet in length from the tip of its snout to the end of its long whip-like tail. It weighs perhaps 15 to 20 tons, though some estimates go higher. When it walks, which it does slowly and steadily, its footfalls are felt through the ground at a considerable distance. Each footstep leaves an impression in soft soil that is roughly the size of a kitchen table. And Diplodocus is not even the largest. Brachiosaurus, with its famously elongated neck reaching upward at an angle that suggests a giraffe's logic taken to an almost absurd extreme, stands perhaps 40 feet tall at the top of its head. It feeds on vegetation at heights that no other terrestrial animal could reach, browsing the tops of conifer trees the way a giraffe browses acacia leaves today. Supersaurus, Seismosaurus, Patagotitan, names that carry their own kind of music, would come later and grow even larger still. But the Jurassic is where the template is established, where the body plan that allows such extreme size is refined, tested, and confirmed as viable. How do they support this weight? This is one of the questions I find myself returning to whenever I think about sauropods. The engineering challenges are remarkable. A Brachiosaurus heart would have had to pump blood upward through a neck roughly 30 feet long to reach the brain. The cardiovascular system required to do this, the blood pressure, the muscle mass of the heart itself, is frankly difficult to imagine. Some researchers have proposed that sauropods may have had multiple pumping hearts along the neck, like a series of relay stations. Others suggest that perhaps the neck was held horizontally rather than vertically in most species, reducing the cardiovascular demands. The debate continues. Their bones, meanwhile, are not solid. They are filled with air sacs, pneumatized, like the bones of birds, to reduce weight without sacrificing structural strength. This is one of the pieces of evidence that confirms dinosaurs' close relationship to modern birds. This shared architecture of hollow, air-filled bones connected to a complex system of air sacs throughout the body. I find something deeply peaceful about that connection, about the way evolution carries certain solutions forward across hundreds of millions of years, the hollow bone working just as well for a Jurassic sauropod as it does for a modern sparrow. The same elegant trick, the same reduction of weight, the same increase in respiratory efficiency, separated by incomprehensible spans of time but fundamentally identical in principle. The night is warm and full of sound in the Jurassic. Let me try to describe it for you as you rest. Imagine standing in a Jurassic forest at dusk. The light is fading, a warm amber light that filters through the canopy of tree ferns and conifers and the spreading fern-like fronds of enormous cycads. The air is moist, warm on the skin, carrying the scent of rich soil and green growing things and the distant sweetness of cycad pollen. The sounds are layered. Insects, many of them familiar looking, beetles and dragonflies and early flies, create a constant soft backdrop of buzzing and chirping. Frogs and salamanders contribute their calls from nearby water. The pterosaurs, the flying reptiles that share the Jurassic sky with increasingly sophisticated early birds, pass overhead occasionally, their calls strange and unbird-like, more like the honks of geese but lower and resonant. And then, from somewhere in the forest, the deep, rhythmic sound of sauropod footsteps, not rapid, not alarming, just steady like a slow, biological drumbeat, growing slightly louder and then gradually receding as a group of Brachiosaurus moves through the forest somewhere in the middle distance, browsing in the growing dark. You could almost fall asleep to that sound. I think about what it would feel like to be there, not in fear, just in wonder. Standing in the last of the amber light as these enormous gentle giants move through the trees, their necks swaying slightly with each step, their feet leaving those enormous depressions in the soft forest floor. There is something about extreme size when it is not threatening you that is very calming. Something about the sheer unhurried scale of a sauropod's movements. They are too large to be nervous, too large to be hurried. They move at a pace that feels geological, inevitable, steady, entirely unconcerned with the small, fragile things of the world. The carnivores of the Jurassic are no less impressive, though I find them less calming to contemplate in detail. Allosaurus is the dominant large predator in many late Jurassic ecosystems, as a bipedal theropod reaching lengths of perhaps 30 to 40 feet, with a skull structure quite different from the massive bone Tyrannosaurus that would succeed it in later periods. Allosaurus has a lighter skull and smaller teeth, but a powerful upper body, and evidence suggests it may have used a distinctive hatchet attack style, driving its skull downward into prey rather than biting with crushing force. How it hunted sauropods, which are sometimes 10 times its mass, remains genuinely uncertain. Perhaps it targeted juveniles. Perhaps it hunted in loose groups. Perhaps it was primarily a scavenger when it came to the truly enormous prey, opportunistically feeding on the dead rather than expending the enormous energy required to bring down a healthy adult Brachiosaurus. I love these gaps in what we know, these spaces where the evidence runs out and imagination, informed imagination constrained by physics and biology and what the bones can tell us and has room to breathe. Because there is another thing happening in the Jurassic that I want you to know about. Something smaller and quieter and in many ways more consequential than the rise of the giant dinosaurs. The first birds are appearing. Or rather, and this is the more accurate way to say it, certain dinosaurs are becoming birds. The boundary between non-avian dinosaurs and birds is not sharp. It is a gradient, a gradual accumulation of features, feathers, wishbones, particular arrangements of the hip and shoulder, the development of a keeled sternum to anchor flight muscles, that over time produce something we would recognize as a bird. Archaeopteryx, discovered in limestone deposits in Bavaria in the 1860s and still one of the most famous fossils ever found, sits beautifully on this gradient. It has feathers, it has a wishbone. Its skeleton closely resembles that of small Maniraptoran dinosaurs. But it also has teeth, clawed wings, and a long bony tail, features we associate with non-avian dinosaurs rather than birds. When I look at illustrations of Archaeopteryx, this creature that is both and neither, that exists in the blurry zone between what was and what would become, I always feel a particular kind of quiet awe. It is a photograph of evolution in progress, a still frame from the greatest continuous documentary ever made. The Jurassic is long, approximately 55 million years, a span of time longer than the entire period between the end of the dinosaurs and today. Within it, the world shifts. Pangaea continues its slow divorce into Laurasia and Gondwana. Sea levels rise and fall, climates fluctuate. Individual species come and go, leaving their bones in the stone for us to find and wonder over. But the overall shape of the Jurassic world remains consistent, warm, lush, productive, and dominated by the great reptiles. And then, approximately 145 million years ago, the Jurassic ends. Not with catastrophe this time, not with volcanoes or impacts, just with change. The slow, incremental shifts of climate and sea level and ecology that mark the boundary between geological periods. The Cretaceous begins. And in the Cretaceous, things get very interesting. There is a moment in the Cretaceous period, roughly 125 to 100 million years ago, when the world undergoes a transformation so fundamental that its effects are still shaping the planet we live on today. The flowering plants appear. I know that might sound modest. You might be thinking, flowers? Compared to mass extinctions and giant reptiles, flowers don't seem like much of a plot point. But I want to convince you otherwise because I think the rise of the flowering plants, as the angiosperms, is one of the most important events in the history of life, and its effects on the Cretaceous world were profound and far-reaching. Before the angiosperms, the dominant plants are gymnosperms, conifers, cycads, ginkgos, ferns. These are ancient plant lineages, enormously successful, but they share a particular reproductive strategy. Their seeds are exposed, pollinated primarily by wind, and they invest relatively little in attracting specific pollinators. Angiosperms change this. Flowers are, at their core, a sophisticated reproductive advertisement, a structure evolved to attract specific insects, birds, and other animals, and incentivize them to carry pollen from one plant to another. In exchange for this service, the plant offers nectar, oils, and other rewards. This is a co-evolutionary bargain of extraordinary power. As flowers evolve to better attract pollinators, pollinators evolve to better exploit flowers. Each drives the other forward in an escalating feedback loop of mutual adaptation. The result over millions of years is the astonishing diversity of flowering plants we see today, and the equally astonishing diversity of insects, birds, and mammals that co-evolved alongside them. In the Cretaceous, this process is just beginning. Early flowering plants are modest, small weedy things growing in disturbed habitats and along waterways, gradually pushing into environments previously dominated by gymnosperms. But they are spreading, and as they spread, they are changing the world. The insect fauna of the Cretaceous explodes in diversity as pollinators and flower visitors diversify alongside their plant partners. Bees appear. The earliest bees preserved in Cretaceous amber are recognizably bee-like, carrying pollen in baskets on their legs just as modern bees do. Butterflies, moths, flies. The pollinating insects are diversifying rapidly, each lineage tracking the expansion of the flowering plants. And this matters for the dinosaurs, because changed plant communities mean changed food availability, changed herbivore communities, changed predator communities. The hadrosaurs, the duck-billed dinosaurs that become enormously successful in the late Cretaceous, may owe some of their success to their sophisticated dental batteries capable of processing tougher, more diverse plant material, including the spreading angiosperms. The ceratopsians, the horned dinosaurs like Triceratops, have beaked mouths seemingly well suited to cropping low-growing vegetation, including the new flowering plants. The Cretaceous world is not the world of the Jurassic. It is warmer in places. Sea levels are high, among the highest in all of Earth's history, and vast shallow seas called epicontinental seas cover enormous areas of the continents. The Western Interior Seaway divides North America nearly in two, stretching from the Arctic Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico, a warm shallow body of water teeming with marine life including enormous predatory marine reptiles, mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, ancient sharks and fish of spectacular variety. Let me take a moment here, because I think we tend to forget about the seas when we think about the age of the dinosaurs, and that's a loss. Imagine drifting just below the surface of the Western Interior Seaway, perhaps 75 million years ago. The water is warm and relatively clear, lit by filtered sunlight from above. Schools of fish move in the middle distance, primitive teleosts, ancestral to the modern fish that fill today's oceans. Turtles cruise past, some of them enormous by modern standards, sea turtles with shells the size of small cars, and then, from deeper water, something rises toward you. A mosasaur, a tylosaurus perhaps, one of the largest of its kind, reaching lengths of 40 feet or more. It is a lizard essentially, but one that has returned to the sea and been reshaped by millions of years of aquatic life. Its limbs have become flippers, its tail has deepened into a vertical fin like that of a shark. Its jaws are long and filled with conical teeth for catching fish. It passes beneath you without interest, angling upward toward a school of ammonites, ancient cephalopods coiled in their spiral shells, pumping through the water with jet propulsion. The mosasaur's jaws close on one with a dull crack, and it continues on its way, leaving the shattered fragments of shell drifting downward in its wake. Above, on the shore of this ancient seaway, a Tyrannosaurus moves through the undergrowth, and this is the thing that still strikes me every time I think about it. Tyrannosaurus rex lived closer in time to us than it did to the dinosaurs of the Jurassic. The reign of T-Rex and the reign of Stegosaurus are separated by roughly 80 million years, a gap larger than the one between Tyrannosaurus and the present day. Let that settle. The famous dinosaurs of popular culture, T-Rex, Triceratops, Velociraptor, are late Cretaceous dinosaurs, separated from Stegosaurus and Brachiosaurus by a gulf of time that makes them, in a very real sense, distant historical relatives rather than contemporaries. Tyrannosaurus rex. I have to talk about Tyrannosaurus rex. I know it is perhaps the most discussed, most written about, most reconstructed animal in all of paleontology, and you might feel like you've heard everything there is to say about it. But I promise you, the more closely you look at what we actually know about this animal, the more interesting it becomes. For most of the 20th century, Tyrannosaurus was reconstructed as a relatively simple beast, an enormous, bipedal predator with powerful jaws and relatively small arms, probably slow-moving, possibly a scavenger. The children's book version, a reptilian killing machine, essentially a scaled-up lizard with ambitions. The picture that has emerged from research over the last few decades is dramatically more complex, and I think more wonderful. Tyrannosaurus probably had feathers, or at least some feathers, particularly during its juvenile stages. This is inferred from the feathered tyrannosauroids known from China, smaller relatives that preserve clear evidence of filamentous, proto-feather structures on their bodies. Whether adult Tyrannosaurus retained significant feathers or shed most of them for thermoregulatory reasons as they grew to enormous mass remains uncertain, but the possibility of a feathered tyrannosaur is scientifically legitimate. Tyrannosaurus was almost certainly warm-blooded, or at least in the broad category of warm-blooded that includes modern birds and mammals. Evidence from bone histology, growth rates, and metabolic reconstruction all point toward an animal with high metabolic rates relative to modern crocodiles or lizards. The arms. Everyone talks about the arms. They are small, famously, almost comically small, relative to the animal's enormous body. But they are not vestigial. The muscles attached to them were, by estimates, capable of extraordinary force. Each arm could curl several hundred pounds. The popular hypothesis that they are useless has given way to more interesting speculation that they may have been used for holding prey close during feeding, or for leveraging the animal off the ground after lying down, or possibly for mating-related behaviours. The sensory system of Tyrannosaurus was remarkable. The brain, revealed by endocasts of skull fossils, shows enlarged olfactory lobes, suggesting an acute sense of smell that may have been among the finest of any land animal that ever lived. The eyes faced somewhat forward, providing binocular vision and depth perception, well beyond what most reptiles have. The hearing range, estimated from inner ear anatomy, may have included low-frequency sounds imperceptible to humans, vibrations in the ground, the distant movement of large animals through vegetation. It would have heard you coming long before you saw it. I want to describe a Tyrannosaurus encounter for you. Not a dramatic, screaming film encounter, but a quieter one. The kind you might experience, I imagine, if you were somehow there. You are in the late Cretaceous of what will one day be Montana, Hell Creek, in the final millions of years before the extinction. The environment is a coastal plain, low, flat, warm and swampy in places, with broad floodplains and river deltas running toward the receding western interior seaway. The air is warm and humid, carrying the smell of water and rich vegetation. Cycads and early angiosperms, magnolias and primitive flowering trees grow alongside the remaining conifers. You're standing very still in the shade of a large conifer when the forest goes quiet. The insects stop buzzing. The pterosaurs in the canopy fall silent. The small, mouse-like mammals that were rustling through the leaf litter a moment ago have disappeared entirely. And then, distantly at first but growing steadily, a vibration in the ground. Not a drumbeat exactly. Too slow for that. More like a deep geological pulse, as if the earth itself is breathing. It comes into view from between the trees, moving with that surprisingly efficient gait that biomechanical studies have suggested. Not the lunging, charging Hollywood version, but something more like the deliberate energy-conserving stride of a very large bird. Perhaps 12 to 15 kilometers per hour in normal travel, faster in short bursts. The head is enormous. You know this intellectually, but seeing it is different. The skull alone is 5 feet long, and the way it moves, tilted slightly downward, swinging faintly from side to side as the animal walks, gives the impression of something scanning, searching. The tiny forelimbs are pressed against the massive chest. The tail extends behind, almost horizontal, a long counterbalance to the forward-weighted body. It passes perhaps 30 meters from where you stand, and it does not stop. It does not smell you because, and this is the detail I always find strangely comforting, you are downwind, and you are holding perfectly still, and perhaps those small, warm-blooded mammals evolved their extraordinary stillness precisely for moments like this one. The ground continues to pulse faintly for several minutes after it has gone, and then the insects begin again, and the pterosaurs shift in the canopy, and the forest exhales. This is the Cretaceous world, vast and warm and full of life, dominated by animals of extraordinary variety and sophistication, running on the biological clockwork that evolution has been refining for 185 million years. And it is, in 66 million years' time, going to end. But not yet. Not yet. There are still tens of millions of years left. Tens of millions of years of ordinary days. Days of hunting and browsing and nesting and sleeping under Cretaceous skies. Days that feel, to the animals living them, like days have always felt. Immediate. Real. The only day there is. Rest in that for a while. The ordinary miracle of a day. Now. I want to start laying out the mystery. Not loudly, not dramatically, just gently, carefully, the way a geologist lays out a core. Sample on a laboratory table, pointing to the layers and saying, look at this, and now, look at this. Because there is something peculiar buried in the rock record of the late Cretaceous, something that scientists noticed decades ago and have been arguing about, in the quiet and productive way that scientists argue ever since. The rock record is the best continuous diary the Earth has ever kept. Sedimentary rocks form when particles of material, mud, sand, shell fragments, volcanic ash, settle at the bottom of water bodies and slowly accumulate layer upon layer over time. The bottom layer is the oldest, the top layer is the newest, and in those layers are preserved not just the fossils of the organisms that lived at the time, but chemical signatures of the atmosphere, the temperature of the oceans, the presence or absence of oxygen, the entire environmental story of that moment written in mineral and molecular code. When geologists look at the sedimentary layers that span the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, the K-Pig boundary, the line in the rock that marks the end of the age of the dinosaurs, they find something that stops them. A thin layer of clay, globally, everywhere this boundary is exposed, in Montana, in Spain, in Denmark, in New Zealand, in Tunisia. There is a layer of clay, rarely more than a centimetre thick, that is dramatically different from the rock layers above and below it. And within this clay layer, there is something specific. Something that, when physicist and Nobel laureate Luis Alvarez and his geologist son Walter examined samples in the 1970s, made them look at each other and say something like, "That cannot be right. Iridium." The clay layer at the KPG boundary is enriched in iridium to a degree that is, in normal geological contexts, essentially impossible. Iridium is a platinum group metal. It is extraordinarily rare in the Earth's crust. The planet's iridium sank to the core during Earth's formation, leaving the surface layers almost entirely depleted. You might expect to find a few parts per trillion of iridium in normal sedimentary rock. In the KPG clay layer, the concentration is often 100 times higher, sometimes 1,000 times higher. Where does iridium come from when it is not from the Earth's crust? From space. Meteorites are rich in iridium, remnants of the early solar system, before the heavier metals settled to the cores of forming planets. A sufficiently large impactor, an asteroid or comet, would carry enormous quantities of iridium, and an impact large enough to distribute that iridium globally, embedding it in a thin, uniform layer in ocean sediments and terrestrial deposits worldwide, would have to be of a size almost incomprehensible in human terms. The Alvarez hypothesis, proposed in 1980, was this. Approximately 66 million years ago, a large extraterrestrial body struck the Earth. The impact was catastrophic in scale. The environmental consequences were severe enough to cause a mass extinction. The iridium layer is the signature, preserved in stone, of the impactor's material distributed globally in the fallout. When this hypothesis was proposed, it was met with considerable skepticism. Catastrophism, the idea that geological change can be driven by sudden dramatic events, had been largely out of fashion in mainstream geology since the 19th century, replaced by the doctrine of uniformitarianism, the idea that present processes acting slowly over time explain all geological features. An asteroid impact was, to many geologists of the time, uncomfortably close to science fiction. But then something happened that changed everything. In 1991, a geological structure in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico was confirmed as an impact crater of precisely the right age. The Chicxulub crater. It is enormous. The central crater is approximately 93 miles in diameter, making it one of the largest confirmed impact structures on Earth. But the full extent of the impact structure, including the outer rings, is estimated at perhaps 180 miles across. It is buried beneath several kilometers of sedimentary rock and the waters of the Gulf of Mexico, which is why it took until the 1970s for it to be identified at all, and until 1991 for its age and impact origin to be confirmed. The impact that created Chicxulub, the object that hit, is estimated to have been approximately 6 miles in diameter, a mountain-sized rock, or ball of ice and rock, moving at perhaps 20 kilometers per second. And here is the number that I want you to hold in your mind as you rest tonight, not to frighten you, because this happened 66 million years ago, and nothing about it can reach you now, but just to appreciate the scale of what we're talking about. The energy released by the Chicxulub impact is estimated at approximately 100 million megatons. The most powerful nuclear weapon ever detonated by humans released approximately 50 megatons of energy. The Chicxulub impact released the equivalent of 2 million such weapons firing simultaneously, in a fraction of a second, at a single point on the surface of the Earth. The immediate effects were, of course, utterly beyond the scale of anything modern humans have experienced or can truly imagine. The ground surrounding the impact site was vaporized. An enormous crater formed in what is now the Gulf of Mexico. A fireball expanded across thousands of miles of sky. Seismic waves radiated through the Earth's interior, triggering earthquakes and volcanic eruptions across the globe. A tsunami, or rather a series of tsunamis of unimaginable size, radiated outward across the ancient oceans, all of this within the first hours. But the immediate effects are not what killed the dinosaurs. What killed the dinosaurs was what came afterward. And this is where the story gets really interesting, because the more closely scientists look at what actually happened in the years and decades following the Chicxulub impact, the more complex and surprising the picture becomes. And the more they look, the more clues they uncover buried in that thin layer of rock. The stranger certain details appear, but let me not get ahead of myself. There is more world to describe first, more ancient beauty to drift through together, a kind reminder. If this story is helping you unwind tonight, please don't forget to subscribe to keep the channel alive. It means more than you know. Let's continue. I want to take you back now, away from the iridium and the craters and the scientific arguments, back to the world itself. It is approximately 66.5 million years ago. The Cretaceous is drawing toward its end, though nothing alive knows this. The seasons are turning as they always have. The rivers are running as they always have. The herds of hadrosaurs are migrating as they always have. Let me describe this world to you, in detail because I think it deserves to be seen clearly before we talk about its ending. The Hell Creek environment, the floodplain ecosystem in what is today the northern United States, is rich and varied in the way that major river delta ecosystems tend to be. Rivers run broadly and shallowly across a coastal plain, flooding seasonally and depositing fertile sediment as they recede. The vegetation is dense along the waterways, palm-like plants, early flowering trees, tree ferns, and more open on the higher ground, with conifer forests and spreading cycad glades. The diversity of life in this environment is extraordinary. Among the plants, the first primitive magnolias are blooming in the undergrowth, their large waxy flowers among the earliest flowering plant structures to appear in the fossil record. Ferns, hundreds of millions of years old as a lineage, still carpet the forest floor. Ancient relatives of sycamores, planes, and redwoods rise above them. The smell of the forest, if you could stand in it, would be something like a very warm, humid, temperate forest. Organic, rich, slightly sweet from the flowering plants, piney from the conifers. Among the animals, the hadrosaurs are here in enormous numbers. Edmontosaurus, one of the largest hadrosaurs, reaching lengths of 40 feet, moves in herds across the floodplains. Their dental batteries contain hundreds of closely packed teeth, forming a single grinding surface, the most sophisticated chewing apparatus in the dinosaur record, capable of processing enormous quantities of plant material. I find hadrosaurs genuinely charming, and I want to take a moment to say so. They don't get the attention of T-Rex or Triceratops, but there is something appealing about the sheer exuberance of their biology. Some species had elaborate crest structures on their skulls, hollow crests that may have functioned as resonating chambers, allowing them to produce deep resonant vocalizations that would have carried across the floodplains. Imagine the sound. A deep, mournful horn-like call, echoing across an ancient river delta at dawn, the mist rising from the water, the early light warm on the backs of 100 moving animals. That is a sound no human has ever heard. But the physics of hollow bone resonators does not change, and so we can, in principle, reconstruct its frequency, if not its emotional quality. Triceratops shares this landscape. It is one of the most recognizable animals to ever live. The three-horned face, the enormous bony frill at the back of the skull, the rhinoceros-like body plan. Triceratops could reach lengths of nearly 30 feet and weights of perhaps 12 to 15 tons. The horns are real weapons. Evidence of healed puncture wounds on Triceratops' frills suggests they engaged in serious combat, possibly with each other and possibly with predators. The frill, which in older reconstructions was often illustrated as a flat bone plate with simple colouring, is now understood to have been supplied with blood vessels that may have enabled it to flush with colour, red perhaps, or yellow, in display situations. A Triceratops flushing its frill crimson in a confrontation with a rival is not a fantasy. It is a biologically plausible behaviour supported by vascular anatomy preserved in fossils. The diversity of the late Cretaceous goes well beyond these famous names, of course. Pachycephalosaurs, the dome-headed dinosaurs, are here, their thick bony skulls suggesting head-butting behaviours similar to modern bighorn sheep. Ankylosaurus, armoured like a tank and carrying a massive tail club of fused bone, moves through the undergrowth with the unhurried calm of an animal that has very few predators capable of penetrating its defences. The skies are busy. Quetzalcoatlus, one of the largest pterosaurs ever to exist, soars overhead on wings spanning perhaps 36 feet. This is an animal the size of a small airplane, and reconstructions suggest it could travel enormous distances by soaring on thermals, potentially crossing continents. On the ground, it may have stalked prey like a living stalk, using its enormous jaws to take small dinosaurs and mammals. Birds are now common and diverse in the late Cretaceous. Not quite modern birds, many still have teeth, and the evolutionary diversity of early bird lineages is complex and not fully resolved, but birds nonetheless, occupying many of the ecological niches that birds occupy today. Beneath the feet of all these animals, in the leaf litter and the rotting wood and the shallow burrows along riverbanks, the small mammals are going about their quiet, warm-blooded lives. They are small, the size of mice to perhaps the size of a modern opossum. They are mostly nocturnal, avoiding the dinosaurs that rule the daylight. They eat insects, small vertebrates, seeds, and fruits. They do not know that the world is about to be handed to them. How could they? Every day is just a day. Every dawn is just the return of the light. I think about this sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep. The way that any given moment, even one at the very edge of something enormous and transformative, feels like just a moment. The animals of the late Cretaceous had no sense of ending. The Triceratops eating low-growing ferns by a riverbank in what would eventually be South Dakota had no awareness that it was living in the last chapter of something vast. It was simply eating, and the light was warm on its frill. And the water moved over the rocks nearby. That is enough. That is everything, really. The light warm on your skin, the sound of water. Rest in that. The world is ancient and the night is quiet and nothing needs to be resolved right now. I want to tell you what happened on that day with as much accuracy and as much quiet as I can manage, because it is, in its own terrible way, one of the most remarkable stories the Earth has to tell, and I think it deserves to be told gently. It is late in the Cretaceous period. The date, in human calendar terms, was approximately 66,038,000 years ago, a figure precise enough to tell us it happened in spring or early summer in the northern hemisphere, according to geochemical analysis of the fossils found just below the KPG boundary. The dinosaurs of the Hell Creek Formation were living through what, for the northern hemisphere, may have been late spring. Somewhere above the Earth, possibly for millions of years in a stable orbit, an asteroid has been travelling. It is a member of the carbonaceous chondrite family, rich in carbon compounds and metals including iridium. It is roughly 6 miles in diameter. Moving at approximately 20 kilometers per second, it enters the upper atmosphere at a shallow angle. The entry alone is catastrophic. The friction of atmospheric entry at such speeds generates temperatures in the tens of thousands of degrees. The asteroid does not simply fall, it punches through the atmosphere like a fist through paper, compressing the air ahead of it into a superheated plasma, creating a channel of incandescent gas that would have been visible from thousands of miles away as a blinding streak across the sky. The impact itself takes approximately 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, approximately 100 million megatons of kinetic energy are converted to heat, seismic waves, and ejecta. The rock beneath the impact, limestone and evaporate sediments rich in sulfur, beneath a shallow sea, is not merely shattered. It is vaporized, melted, accelerated upward and outward at velocities far exceeding the speed of sound. The crater forms in minutes. A ring of mountains rises and then partially collapses. The seafloor rebounds, throwing water in all directions. The tsunami waves generated by this displacement, waves hundreds of feet tall at their origin, propagate outward across the Gulf of Mexico and the surrounding ocean basins. Now, here, is where the most important effects begin. The impact vaporizes an enormous quantity of sulfur-bearing rock, the limestone and evaporate layers that form the geology of the Yucatan Peninsula. This sulfur, launched into the upper atmosphere as sulfur dioxide, combines with water vapor to form sulfuric acid aerosols. These aerosols are extraordinarily reflective. They scatter incoming sunlight back into space. Additionally, the impact throws an enormous quantity of debris, rock, soot, dust, into the upper atmosphere and potentially into space, some of which falls back as incandescent projectiles raining down globally and igniting wildfires across vast areas of the continents. The combination of sulfuric acid aerosols and debris creates what is called an impact winter. The sunlight reaching the Earth's surface drops dramatically. Estimates range from a 10% to as much as 80% reduction in surface light levels. The temperature drops. Global average temperatures may fall by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius within months of the impact and may remain depressed for years to decades. For photosynthesis, for all the plants that form the base of every terrestrial food chain, This is catastrophic. Without light, plants cannot photosynthesize. Without photosynthesis, plants die. Without plants, the herbivores that eat them starve. Without herbivores, the carnivores that eat the herbivores starve. The collapse propagates upward through the food chain from the bottom. In the oceans, the disaster is equally profound. The acidification from atmospheric CO2 and the sulfuric acid aerosols devastates the marine food chains at their base. The phytoplankton that sustain virtually all ocean life die off in massive numbers. The food chain collapses here too, from the bottom up, and the sulfur is doing something else as well. The sulfur dioxide emissions are estimated at several 100 billion tons. This is not an abstract number. This is enough sulfur to fundamentally alter the chemistry of the global atmosphere for years. The acid rain generated by these aerosols dissolves in water and falls across the world's surfaces, oceans, rivers, forests, acidifying everything it touches. The Chicxulub impact is not a single event with a single cause of extinction. It is a cascade, a chain reaction of environmental disasters, each feeding the next, amplifying and extending the damage far beyond what any one factor alone could achieve. The non-avian dinosaurs die, not instantly, not in a single day, but over the months and years following the impact, as the food chains they depend on collapse and the climate they evolve for vanishes. The last Tyrannosaurus may have died of starvation in a darkened world, surrounded by the bodies of the hadrosaurs and ceratopsians it had relied upon, which had themselves died of starvation or cold in the absence of sunlight. I have to stop for a moment here, because I think about this quite often. That last individual, whatever it was, a hadrosaur, a tyrannosaur, a small ceratopsian, a pterosaur roosting in the last surviving conifers, as the light continued to be wrong, the warmth continued to be wrong, everything continuing to be wrong. It didn't know what had happened. It only knew that the world had changed in ways that nothing in the long history of its lineage had prepared it for. And I think there is something in that, something that doesn't need to be spelled out too explicitly, that resonates with what it is to be any living thing facing circumstances beyond its comprehension. The world is always larger than the creatures living in it understand, and sometimes that is terrifying, and sometimes it is simply true, simply a fact of existence. That the world extends beyond perception in every direction, and most of what happens in it is neither for nor against you specifically. It simply is. There is a strange comfort in that late at night. Breathe the darkness outside. Your window is the same darkness that has always been there. You are safe where you are. Life did not end at the KPG boundary. I want to be very clear about this, because the word extinction, even mass extinction, can sometimes be misread as meaning total annihilation. It does not. The KPG mass extinction was, by most estimates, approximately a 75% extinction event for species, which means approximately 25% of species alive at the time survived, which means, in absolute terms, that an enormous amount of life made it through. What did the survivors have in common? This is one of the most fascinating questions in all of paleontology, because the answer tells us something fundamental about which biological strategies confer resilience in the face of catastrophic environmental disruption. Small body size is one factor. Small animals require less food to sustain themselves. In a world where food chains have collapsed and resources are scarce, an animal that can survive on very little has a significant advantage. The small mammals that would eventually give rise to all modern mammalian lineages, to every horse, whale, bat, elephant, primate and rodent alive today, were small. They could hide. They could eat whatever was available. They could survive. Generalist feeding habits. Animals that can eat a wide variety of foods, insects, seeds, fungi, carrion, roots, are more resilient than specialists that depend on specific food sources. Many of the KPG survivors were dietary generalists. The birds that made it through were, by the evidence, primarily ground-dwelling seed-eaters, or insectivores, not the specialized piscivores or herbivores, but the flexible, adaptable ones, aquatic and semi-aquatic habits. The impact winter does not affect freshwater ecosystems as severely as terrestrial ones, at least initially. Rivers and lakes still contain organic material, detritus from the pre-impact world that can sustain life for years after the photosynthetic base has collapsed. Many freshwater fish, turtles, crocodilians, and frogs survived the KPG event by living in and around rivers and lakes where food continued to be available. And then there is the group that I find most remarkable, the birds. Not all birds survived. Many bird lineages went extinct at the KPG boundary, but some did survive, the ancestors of all modern bird diversity. And what is extraordinary is that from this small seed population, the radiation of modern birds following the extinction is one of the most explosive adaptive radiations in the history of vertebrate life. Within a few million years of the KPG boundary, the basic lineages of modern birds, the ancestors of every parakeet, pelican, penguin, owl, and songbird alive today, are established. The world they radiate into is emptied of its former dominant fauna, and every vacant ecological niche is an opportunity. The small mammals do the same thing, on a slightly longer timescale. The first few million years of the Paleocene, the period immediately following the Cretaceous, see the emergence of small, primitive placental and marsupial mammal lineages that quickly begin diversifying into the vast array of mammalian body plans we know today. The first primates appear within a few million years of the boundary, small tree-dwelling insectivores in tropical forests that are gradually recolonizing and diversifying as the photosynthetic base of the food chains rebuilds. The world that emerges from the KPG extinction is not a dead world. It is an empty one, a world of vast, unopened ecological space, waiting for life to pour back into it. And life does. Life is extraordinarily good at this, at finding the gaps, at filling the spaces, at evolving into whatever role is left vacant by the previous occupants. 66 million years later, which is to say, now, you are one of those survivors' descendants. Every human being alive today is the product of that chain of survival, stretching back through the KPG boundary and the small, frightened generalist mammals that made it through, and back further still through hundreds of millions of years of prior survival and adaptation, all the way to the very first cells that formed in the warm chemical soup of early Earth's oceans. You are the current installment in the longest story ever told. I find that comforting, in a very deep way. You are the universe looking at itself and knowing it is here. That matters. Now. Now I want to return to something. I promised you a mystery, and I've been laying the pieces out slowly, carefully, one by one. The iridium layer, the Chicxulub crater, the impact winter, the collapse of the food chains, the extinction of 75% of species. This is the standard story of the KPG extinction. It is taught in textbooks. It is the scientific consensus, and it is, in all its major outlines, correct. But there is always a but. Here is the thing about the rock record at the KPG boundary that keeps scientists up at night, or would if scientists didn't have a healthy appreciation for ambiguity and unresolved questions. The extinctions don't all happen at the same time. This is the detail. This is the piece that I want you to sit with. When paleontologists examine the fossil record of non-avian dinosaurs in the Hell Creek Formation, the best studied late Cretaceous terrestrial ecosystem in the world, they find something unexpected. The diversity of dinosaur species appears to decline gradually in the last few million years before the KPG boundary. This is called the 3-meter problem in some discussions. The observation that in the 3 meters of rock immediately below the KPG boundary, dinosaur fossils become increasingly sparse. Some researchers interpret this as evidence that the dinosaur fauna was already in decline before the impact, potentially due to other environmental stresses. And there's more, the Deccan Traps. India, approximately 66 million years ago, is not where it is today. It is in the southern hemisphere, separated from Asia by a wide ocean, and beneath it, enormous volcanic activity has been building for hundreds of thousands of years. The Deccan Traps are a vast volcanic province, a flood basalt event of enormous scale, covering much of what is now West Central India in layer upon layer of solidified lava. The eruptions began perhaps 400,000 years before the KPG boundary and continued for perhaps 500,000 years afterward. The total volume of lava erupted is approximately 500,000 cubic kilometers. This volcanic activity released enormous quantities of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere over hundreds of thousands of years, not as a single catastrophic pulse, as the Chicxulub impact did, but as a prolonged, ongoing perturbation to global climate. The question that scientists are actively debating is this: how much of the KPG mass extinction was caused by the Chicxulub impact, and how much was caused, or primed, by the Deccan traps. And here is the genuinely peculiar observation. The pace of the Deccan eruptions appears to have changed around the time of the Chicxulub impact. The seismic energy released by the impact, travelling through the Earth's interior in waves, may have triggered an acceleration of the Deccan volcanism. The impact and the volcanic activity may have been coupled, at least to some degree. The extinction event was not a single bullet. It was a convergence. Multiple stressors, declining dinosaur diversity due to long-term climate change, the ongoing Deccan volcanism already disrupting global climate, and then the sudden catastrophic punch of the Chicxulub impact, all arriving in what is, in geological terms, essentially the same moment. The metaphor I always reach for is this. Imagine a building that has been slowly developing structural weaknesses for years, cracks in the foundation, corrosion in the supports, and then a significant earthquake strikes. The earthquake alone might not have brought down a healthy building, but this building, already compromised, comes down completely. The dinosaurs, in this view, were not a thriving, invincible fauna cut down at the peak of their power by a bolt from the blue. They were a fauna dealing with long-term environmental challenges, hit by a catastrophic event that, in the context of those challenges, proved unsurvivable. But here is the twist that I find most surprising, the one I've been saving. There is new evidence, published in just the last few years, that the Chicxulub impact may have struck at a particularly unfortunate angle and position. The Yucatan Peninsula rock that the impactor struck was, as I mentioned, rich in sulfur-bearing evaporites. This is significant because the release of sulfur into the upper atmosphere was a primary driver of the impact winter. Other impact sites, hitting granite for instance, or deep ocean crust, would have released far less sulfur and potentially caused a much less severe extinction. There is a real scientific argument that if the same asteroid had struck a different part of the Earth, even a relatively small change in trajectory, the extinction might have been far less severe. The asteroid might not have been powerful enough to cause a mass extinction on its own. It was the specific chemistry of what it hit that made the difference. And there is more. Recent drilling projects into the Chicxulub crater, directly into the peak ring, the mountainous ring of rock at the centre of the ancient impact structure, have recovered rock samples that are extraordinary in what they reveal. The rock was heated so intensely that it melted and then instantly resolidified as glass. The crystalline structure of the minerals preserves a record of pressures and temperatures that defy ordinary geological imagination. But within these samples, something else was found that initially puzzled the researchers: microbial life. Bacteria and other microorganisms colonizing the impact melt rock within tens of thousands of years of the impact, surviving the catastrophe, finding a niche in the cooling impact structure, and beginning the process of rebuilding a living community in what should have been a sterile environment. I find this detail quietly extraordinary. Within tens of thousands of years, which is an eye blink in geological time, life had already found a way back, not the complex, sophisticated life that the impact had disrupted, but life, the stubborn, persistent, infinitely adaptable foundation of it, already re-establishing itself, already feeling its way back into the newly available space, and then, over the millions of years that followed, everything else would follow. The first mammals exploring the emptied landscapes, the first flowering plants diversifying in the newly opened ecological space, the first birds filling the skies, and eventually, 66 million years on, creatures with large brains and small bodies and opposable thumbs, lying in soft, warm places at night and wondering about all the things that came before them. There is a kind of continuity in that, a thread running all the way from those first microbial colonizers of the Chicxulub melt rock, through the small mammals of the Paleocene, through all the long and branching history of primate evolution, to here, to you, to this moment. The mystery of the end of the dinosaurs is also the story of how everything that came after them, including you, came to be. And that is not a sad story. It is, when you look at it clearly, a remarkable one. I want to spend some time in the world after the dinosaurs, not to rush past the 66 million years between the KPG boundary and today, but to let you feel the shape of it, the scale of the recovery, the way the Earth rebuilt itself patiently, one species at a time, 1 million years at a time, until eventually it became the world you live in. The Paleocene epoch, the first geological period following the Cretaceous, is a world in transition. The climate is recovering. The sulfuric acid aerosols have largely settled out within a decade or two of the impact. The longer-lasting effects, the atmospheric CO2 from all that incinerated limestone, the Deccan volcanic emissions, produce a greenhouse warming that lasts hundreds of thousands to millions of years. The Paleocene is, overall, a warm period by modern standards. Polar regions support temperate forests. Tropical forests are dense and lush. But the world is fundamentally different from the Cretaceous. It is emptied. The large megafauna, everything weighing more than roughly 25 kilograms, has been severely depopulated. The niches that the dinosaurs and their contemporaries occupied for 185 million years are vacant, and nature, as it always does, begins to fill them. The mammals of the early Paleocene are small and generalized, but they are diversifying rapidly. The early condylarths, primitive ungulate-like mammals, give rise to the ancestors of every even-toed and odd-toed hoofed mammal: horses, rhinos, hippos, deer, cattle. The early mesonychids, large, vaguely wolf-like mammals, fill the carnivore niches vacated by the non-avian dinosaurs. By the Eocene epoch, beginning approximately 56 million years ago, the mammalian radiation is producing some familiar-looking animals. The ancestors of modern whales are leaving the shore and beginning the long journey back into the water that will eventually produce the most massive animals in Earth's history. Early horses, barely larger than a fox, are browsing on forest vegetation in North America and Europe. Primitive primates are diversifying in tropical forests. The world is beginning to look recognizable. Not modern, there is no grass yet, and the familiar mammal fauna of modern times is still tens of millions of years away, but recognizable in its logic, in the principle of it. Large herbivores on plains, large carnivores hunting them, small clever omnivores exploiting the margins. The Earth's plates, meanwhile, are continuing their movement. The Atlantic Ocean is widening, Australia is drifting northward away from Antarctica, India is rushing toward Asia at a geologically rapid pace, and when it arrives, approximately 50 million years ago, the collision that creates the Himalayas begins, a mountain-building event that is still ongoing today. The Eocene is followed by the Oligocene, and the Oligocene by the Miocene, and the Miocene by the Pliocene, each epoch seeing the world become a little more modern, a little more familiar. The great ice ages of the Pleistocene bring enormous glaciers grinding across the northern continents, reshaping landscapes, driving evolutionary change in the fauna they isolate and connect in alternating cycles. And then, approximately 300,000 years ago, a species appears in Africa with an unusual combination of features: large brain, upright posture, manual dexterity, and a capacity for symbolic thought that, as far as we can tell, no previous species in the history of Earth has possessed to the same degree. Homo sapiens. And this species, like all species, looks out at the world it finds itself in and tries to understand it. It makes tools, it makes art, it buries its dead, it tells stories around fires about what the world is and how it came to be, and eventually, very recently in geological terms, it develops the capacity to read the rock record, to find the bones of the things that came before it, to reconstruct ancient worlds from fragments of stone, to discover the iridium layer and the Chicxulub crater and piece together, 66 million years after the fact, the story of how the world changed. I find something deeply moving about this. The dinosaurs left no stories behind. They left bones and footprints and occasional, preserved soft tissue and feather impressions, but no record of what they experienced, no art, no memory of themselves, and yet here we are, telling their story, holding their lives in our imaginations, reconstructing their world from its fragments, giving them, in some small way, a continued existence in the minds of the creatures that evolved in the space their extinction left open. That is a gift. A strange, one-directional gift that they could not have anticipated and will never know about. But it is real. So, we have come a long way tonight, from Pangaea to the present, from the small, uncertain first dinosaurs to the enormous world-shaping Jurassic giants to the sophisticated, feathered, warm-blooded late Cretaceous fauna, through the impact winter, through the long emptiness of the early Paleocene, through the patient rebuilding of the living world, through the mystery, the convergence of volcanic and cosmic forces that ended one world and made room for another, through the twist hidden in the rock, still being argued over by scientists who find beauty in ambiguity, the way others find it in certainty. And here we are, here you are, in a warm, safe place, in the present moment, which is 66 million years after all of this, which is, in a very real sense, the beneficiary of all of this. I want you to let the weight of that settle into you slowly, the way the minerals settled into the Cretaceous seafloor, layer by layer, building up gradually into something solid. You are here because of everything that came before, every extinction and every survival, every warm Jurassic day and every cold impact winter, every small mammal that hid from the cold in its burrow and ate the seeds that were left when everything else was gone. The night is very old, much older than any of the stories we tell about it, and in that oldness, in that vast quiet depth of time, there is something that I find enormously restful. Your worries, your real ones, the ones that feel heavy, tonight, are not diminished by this perspective. They are yours, and they matter. But they exist within something so much larger than themselves, something so ancient and continuous and essentially indifferent in the kindest possible sense. Not cruel, not warm, just vast and ongoing and full of the quiet persistence of life finding its way, that they become, for a moment, bearable. You are a small creature in a very large world, on a very old planet, in an incomprehensibly old universe, and that is wonderful, not frightening, wonderful. Let your breathing slow now, let the images drift. The long Jurassic forests, the warm Cretaceous floodplains, the vast quiet blue of the western interior seaway, the thin line of iridium in ancient stone, let them become soft and formless, the way memories become in the last moments before sleep. You have been here before, or somewhere like here. That same quiet, the kind that settles over you when the day is finally let go, when the light is low and the world outside has dimmed down to a manageable hum, that same sense of sinking slowly, breath by breath, into something deeper and older than the ordinary rhythm of your hours. Welcome back. If you joined us for the first part of this story, you already know how it ends, or at least how the age of the dinosaurs ends. The impact, the winter, the iridium layer, the empty world and its patient rebuilding. You carried all of that with you, and I hope it settled into you gently the way the best stories do. Not as a weight, but as a texture, a new layer of understanding about the planet you live on. But I told you, didn't I, that the story is not finished, because the truth is, one script cannot hold all of it. The age of the dinosaurs lasted 185 million years. 185 million years. If you tried to compress every year of that into a single second of narration, it would take you almost 6 years of continuous speaking to reach the end, and even then you would have only scratched the surface of what that time contained. Tonight, I want to go deeper. I want to take you into the parts of the dinosaur story that most documentaries leave out, the strange corners, the details that make paleontologists pause in the middle of describing a fossil and look slightly distant, the way people do when they are about to say something that still surprises them, even after years of studying it. Because there are more twists in this story than just the meteorite. There are questions buried in the rock record that are stranger, in some ways, than the simple tale of a rock from space ending everything. Questions about how the dinosaurs saw the world and felt it and navigated it. Questions about behaviours we can never fully know but have learned to infer from the most careful reading of bones and sediment and isotopes. Questions about what the end really looked like from the inside, not from the grand perspective of planetary history, but from the perspective of an animal standing on the ground that last afternoon before everything changed. And there is one question I have been saving, a twist within the twist. Something that, when I first encountered it, made me put down what I was reading and sit very quietly for a moment. I will get there, slowly, the way this kind of story deserves to be told. For now, close your eyes, let your body become heavy and still, and let us go back. Here is something I want you to think about as your breathing slows. When we talk about the age of the dinosaurs, we almost always talk about what things looked like, the enormous bodies, the spectacular crests and frills and tail spikes, the vast green forests and the warm inland seas, visual, grand, cinematic. But what did it sound like? What did a Jurassic forest sound like at night? Sit with that question for a moment, because the answer is stranger and more beautiful than you might expect. The acoustic world of the Mesozoic, the era that contains the Triassic, Jurassic and Cretaceous periods, was profoundly different from anything we can hear today. And researchers in the relatively young field of paleoethology, the study of ancient animal behaviour, have spent considerable effort trying to reconstruct it from the available evidence. Let us start with what we know. The insects were singing. We know this with reasonable confidence because the anatomy required for insect sound production, stridulation, rubbing one body part against another to produce a chirping or rasping sound, is well preserved in fossil insects from as far back as the Triassic. Fossilized crickets and katydid relatives from the Jurassic show the exact wing venation required for their characteristic calls. The nights of the Mesozoic, wherever vegetation was dense enough to support insect populations, would have been filled with sound, not identical to modern cricket song but analogous, a texture of high-frequency sound rising and falling with temperature and season. The frogs were calling. Early frog relatives appear in the fossil record from the early Triassic, and true frogs with essentially modern anatomy are present by the Jurassic. Their calls would have added lower, more resonant layers to the nighttime soundscape around bodies of water, and then there were the dinosaurs themselves. This is where it becomes fascinating and strange. For decades, the default assumption was that large dinosaurs were essentially mute in the way that reptiles generally are today. Most living reptiles communicate through hissing, jaw snapping, or body language rather than complex vocalizations. The image of a bellowing Tyrannosaurus, popularized by films and documentaries, had no solid scientific basis for most of paleontological history. But then researchers began to look more carefully at dinosaur skull anatomy, and at what it implied about their capacity for sound production, and the picture became considerably more interesting. Birds, which are the living descendants of theropod dinosaurs, have extraordinary vocal capabilities, produced by an organ called the syrinx, located at the base of the trachea where it splits into the two bronchi leading to the lungs. The syrinx is uniquely bird-like and leaves no skeletal trace, which means we cannot directly detect it in fossil theropods. This has frustrated researchers enormously. However, there is another line of evidence that has emerged in recent years from a completely different direction. Crocodilians, the other living members of the archosaur group that includes both crocodilians and birds, produce sound through a fundamentally different mechanism involving vibrations of tissue in the throat rather than a syrinx. And when researchers studied how juvenile crocodilians communicate with their parents, using low-frequency calls that adults respond to by approaching and protecting the nest, they found something intriguing. The structure of the inner ear in non-avian dinosaurs, particularly in ceratopsians and hadrosaurs, suggests strong sensitivity to low-frequency sound. Hadrosaurs, the duck-billed dinosaurs that were among the most abundant large vertebrates of the late Cretaceous, had elaborate cranial crests in many species that function, according to the most accepted current interpretation, as resonating chambers for producing species-specific calls. The Parasaurolophus, with its remarkable backward-sweeping crest that reaches over a metre in length in large adults, is the most dramatic example. The internal passage within the crest forms a complex loop before connecting to the nasal passage and trachea. Computer modelling of airflow through this structure produces a deep, resonant, multitonal call, something between a foghorn and a woodwind instrument, with a fundamental frequency low enough to carry considerable distances through forest cover. The hadrosaurs were calling to each other, not chirping or squeaking or hissing, calling, with specific voices that would have been distinctive enough in a mixed species herd to identify individual species and perhaps individual animals. Imagine, if you can, standing in the warm late Cretaceous evening, somewhere in what would become Montana or Alberta, and hearing the sound of hadrosaurs calling across a floodplain as the light faded, a deep, carrying, haunting resonance in the humid air, answered from a distance by the same tone slightly altered, slightly different in its harmonic profile, the way individual human voices speaking the same word are still recognizably distinct. That is an image I find almost unbearably beautiful. And there is more. Recent research into theropod vocal anatomy has suggested that many smaller theropods, the feathered bird-like predators of the Cretaceous, may have produced sound in a way similar to living crocodilians and some birds that vocalize with a closed mouth by resonating air through chambers in the skull and throat. These closed-mouth sounds are lower in pitch and more difficult to localize than open-mouth calls, which makes them well suited for communication within dense vegetation and for long-range communication at dawn and dusk. The very large theropods, Tyrannosaurus and its relatives, present a different picture. The skeleton of Tyrannosaurus shows features that suggest an extremely well-developed system of air sacs, similar to those found in modern birds, extending throughout the skeleton and connected to the respiratory system. These air sacs, in modern birds, contribute to the efficiency of breathing during high-energy activity, but they may also have contributed to vocalization. The current best hypothesis for Tyrannosaurus sound production is a deep, low-frequency resonance produced primarily through tissue vibration rather than forced airflow, more similar to the infrasonic communications of elephants and crocodilians than to the high, piercing calls of most birds. It would have been felt as much as heard, a vibration in the chest, in the ground, a physical presence in the air that communicated something simpler and older than language. I am here, I am large, be aware of me. You're lying still now, I imagine, your body settled into the surface beneath you, the weight of the day draining slowly away. And somewhere underneath this room, in the compressed darkness of the geological column, there are layers of rock that once resonated with sounds like these. Not here, perhaps. Perhaps very far away, in a place where the right kind of sediment was laid down in the right kind of basin during the right kind of epoch. But in the geology of this planet, carried in stone the way a recording is carried in grooves, there is the trace of all those sounds, the calling hadrosaurs, the resonating predators, the insect chorus of the Mesozoic night. We will never hear it, but we can know it was there. And knowing it was there is, I think, one of the most extraordinary things that human beings are capable of. Let me tell you about a revolution. Not a violent one, not a sudden, dramatic overturning of everything. This revolution happened slowly, over decades, through the accumulation of evidence so quiet and careful that most people who are not closely following paleontology may have missed it. The revolution is this: we were wrong about how the dinosaurs looked, almost completely wrong in many cases. And the truth is, in my opinion, considerably more beautiful and strange than the grey-green scaly lizards of most of the 20th century's imagination. Let me explain what happened. For most of the history of paleontology, dinosaur reconstructions were built on an obvious but ultimately misleading analogy. Dinosaurs are reptiles. Living reptiles are generally scaly and muted in colour. Therefore, dinosaurs were probably scaly and muted in colour. This assumption was so deeply embedded in the culture of dinosaur illustration that it rarely needed to be defended. It was simply how dinosaurs looked. And then, beginning in the 1990s and accelerating dramatically through the 2000s and 2010s, something extraordinary happened in the fossil beds of northeastern China. Feathers. Not feather impressions in isolated specimens, not ambiguous structures on a few unusual small theropods. Feathers everywhere, on dozens of species, on animals across the theropod family tree, from the small and bird-like to the medium-sized and predatory too, in one case, animals estimated at 9 meters in length. The Yixian Formation of Liaoning Province, China, preserving exceptional fossils from the early Cretaceous, became one of the most important fossil sites in the history of paleontology. The conditions that created it, rapid burial in fine volcanic ash, and lake sediments with low oxygen content that retarded decomposition, were ideal for preserving soft tissue structures that would normally vanish entirely. And what they revealed, specimen after specimen, was that feathers were not a late innovation confined to the direct ancestors of birds. Feathers were ancient. Feathers were common. Feathers were, apparently, the ancestral condition for a huge range of dinosaurs. The adult Tyrannosaurus rex, it should be noted, was probably not feathered, or at least not extensively so. Scale impressions preserved in isolated skin fragments from large tyrannosaurids suggest that at least parts of the body were indeed scaly in very large adults. But juvenile tyrannosaurids, and their smaller relatives, almost certainly had at least some feather-like structures, the way that many large mammals today have hair as juveniles that thins or disappears with age. But many other theropods, the velociraptors and their kin, the troodontids, the oviraptorosaurs, the dromaeosaurids, were feathered in ways that were genuinely spectacular. Some had wings, some had long tail feathers used almost certainly for display, some had feather coloration patterns that we have, in recent years, actually been able to reconstruct with some confidence. This is perhaps the most remarkable development of all. Melanosomes are tiny pigment-containing structures found within feathers. Different shapes of melanosome produce different colours. Spherical melanosomes tend to produce black or grey coloration. Rod-shaped melanosomes produce reddish browns. certain arrangements produce iridescence, and melanosomes are, under the right preservation conditions, detectable in fossil feathers. Beginning around 2010, researchers began analysing the melanosome shapes preserved in the feathers of Chinese fossil theropods, and what they found was extraordinary. Sinosauropteryx, a small feathered theropod from the early Cretaceous, had alternating bands of reddish-brown and white along its tail, a counter-shaded pale underside, a mask-like pattern around its eyes, similar to the facial markings of some modern birds and mammals that live in visually complex environments. Microraptor, a small four-winged dromaeosaurid capable of some form of gliding or flight, had iridescent black plumage similar to modern crows or starlings, producing a glossy, shifting sheen in direct sunlight. Anchiornis, another small feathered theropod, had a reddish-brown crest, a speckled face with white and black flecking, and long hindwing feathers that were white with bold black tips. These are not grey-green lizards. These are vivid, patterned, beautiful animals, and the implication of all of this is significant. If these animals had such complex and specific coloration, they were almost certainly using it for communication, for species recognition, for mate selection, for territorial signalling. They were living in a social and visual world of considerable sophistication, one that required the ability to distinguish subtle differences in pattern and hue, which in turn implies a level of cognitive and social complexity that the old lizard model never suggested. The coloration evidence is currently limited to small feathered theropods preserved in exceptional circumstances. We cannot yet reconstruct the colours of a Tyrannosaurus or a Triceratops with the same confidence. But we can say with reasonable certainty that the assumption of drab, undifferentiated coloration across the group is almost certainly wrong. The rich diversity of colour in living birds and reptiles, whose ancestors span the full range of dinosaur diversity, suggests that the dinosaurs lived in a world as visually rich and complex as our own. Imagine a Cretaceous forest, not as a grey-green backdrop, but as a world of shifting pattern and colour, where an animal crossing a clearing might display a flash of iridescent plumage, or a pattern of spots and bars that said, as clearly as if in words, exactly who and what it was. That forest existed. For millions and millions of years, existed. And then it was gone. But we are beginning slowly to learn how to see it. Let me ask you something. If you had been alive 75 million years ago, and if somehow you had been able to observe the animals of the late Cretaceous without their being able to detect you, what would have surprised you most? I think the honest answer for most people would be this. How much of what you saw would have looked, in some ways, familiar? Not familiar in the sense of recognizable from modern life. Familiar in the sense of animated by intelligible motivations, by behaviours you would recognize, even if the animals performing them were deeply unlike anything you had ever seen. Because the evidence is accumulating that the cognitive and social lives of at least some dinosaurs were considerably more complex than the old image of slow, dim-witted reptiles would suggest. Let me walk you through some of what we know. Nesting behaviour. The discovery of nesting sites belonging to hadrosaurs in Montana in the 1970s and 1980s transformed our understanding of dinosaur social behaviour. The sites, located in the Two Medicine Formation and associated with the species Maiasaura, whose name means, beautifully, good mother lizard, preserved evidence of repeated use across multiple seasons. The nests were bowl-shaped depressions in the earth, arranged at distances roughly equal to the body length of an adult animal. The spacing is exactly what you would expect if territorial defense of the immediate nest area was occurring. More importantly, juvenile Maiasaura bones found in and around the nests showed significant wear on the joint surfaces, evidence that they were mobile, moving around within the nest area, but also evidence that their teeth were being worn in patterns consistent with food being brought to them rather than being collected. The juveniles were being fed. The adults were provisioning the young at the nest the way modern birds do long after hatching. This single observation overturned the assumption that dinosaurs abandoned their eggs after laying and left the young to fend for themselves the way most living reptiles do. Maiasaura was taking care of her young. For how long and with what level of sophistication, we cannot say with certainty. But the evidence of active parental investment, of a social structure organised around the family unit, is there in the rock. Subsequent discoveries amplified this picture. Troodon nests show evidence of incubation posture, with adults sitting on the eggs in a way structurally identical to modern bird incubation. Oviraptorid adults have been found sitting on nests in a brooding posture, preserving the moment of their death in volcanic ash. Sauropod nesting colonies, with dozens of nests in close proximity, suggest that these enormous animals gathered in social groups to reproduce, as many modern birds do. The social lives of the dinosaurs were real, active, organised. And then there is the evidence for play. This is harder to prove, and I want to be careful not to overstate it. But behavioural biologists have established that play behaviour in living animals is associated with cognitive flexibility, with the capacity to practice behaviours in a low-stakes context, with the kind of learning that requires the ability to inhabit hypothetical scenarios rather than simply responding to immediate stimuli. In juvenile dinosaur specimens, particularly theropods, there is occasional evidence of scratch marks and bite patterns on bones that are inconsistent with feeding behaviour but consistent with what, in a living animal, we would describe as play fighting. Young animals testing their strength and reflexes against littermates, establishing social hierarchies, learning the mechanics of predation or defence in a context where the consequences of failure are not lethal. This is again familiar behaviour, recognisably social, recognisably purposeful in a way that the old reptile model does not predict. And then there are the large-brained theropods. The Troodontidae and Dromaeosauridae, the raptors, had the largest brain-to-body mass ratios of any non-avian dinosaurs. Their brain cases, which are sometimes preservable in exceptional specimens, show well-developed optic lobes, indicating excellent vision, but also well-developed cerebellum regions associated with precise motor coordination, and expanded forebrain regions associated in modern animals with learning and behavioural flexibility. The encephalization quotient, a measure of brain size relative to body mass adjusted for scaling, of some troodontids is comparable to that of modern opossums, not impressive by mammalian standards, but meaningfully above the baseline for living reptiles, and the trajectory, the direction of evolutionary change in brain size within this lineage, was upward across the Cretaceous. The last troodontids, in the final millions of years before the extinction, had the largest relative brain sizes of any non-avian dinosaurs that had ever lived. What does that mean in terms of what they were capable of? We cannot know precisely. The brain leaves no fossil. Only the space it occupied in bone is preserved, and brain organisation is as important as brain size for determining cognitive capability. But there is a hypothesis, one I find worth holding gently in the mind as you drift towards sleep, about what might have happened if the extinction had not occurred. The Canadian paleontologist Dale Russell, working in the 1980s, constructed a thought experiment that became briefly famous and somewhat controversial. What might a troodontid have evolved into given another 65 million years? Following the evolutionary trends visible in the fossil record, the increasing brain size, the increasingly upright posture, the freeing of the forelimbs from obligatory locomotor function, Russell proposed that something recognisably convergent with a humanoid body plan might have been possible. He called it somewhat dramatically the dinosauroid. The dinosauroid hypothesis has been criticised on many grounds, and most paleontologists today consider the specific form Russell proposed to be unlikely. Evolution is too contingent, too branching, too dependent on unpredictable ecological pressures to converge so precisely. But the underlying question, whether some lineage of dinosaurs was, at the moment of extinction, on a trajectory towards significantly elevated cognitive complexity, remains genuinely open. The meteor arrived, and we will never know. But the question persists quietly in the back of the literature, in the occasional late-night thought of a paleontologist looking at a troodontid skull and trying to imagine what it knew. I want to take you somewhere smaller for a while. All this talk of giant animals and vast geological periods, sometimes the scale of it can make you feel as if the Mesozoic was defined entirely by what was biggest, by the sauropods stretching their necks above the canopy, by the tyrannosaurids stalking across the floodplains, by the monumental collision of the asteroid and the Earth. But the Mesozoic was also a world of the small and invisible, a world of thousands of species that never appear in popular documentaries. And some of those small, invisible stories are in certain ways more remarkable than anything the giants did. Let me tell you about a few of them. The first is the story of the flowers. Flowering plants, the angiosperms, appear in the fossil record at the beginning of the Cretaceous, approximately 130 to 140 million years ago. Before this, the dominant plants of the Mesozoic were gymnosperms, conifers, cycads, ginkgos, ferns. These are ancient, successful plant groups, but they reproduce through open pollination, releasing pollen into the wind and relying on chance for fertilization. Efficient enough for a world without a better option, but not efficient in the way that what came next would be. The first angiosperms were small, weedy, opportunistic plants, growing at the margins of forests and in disturbed habitats. They were unremarkable in appearance and probably contributed very little to the overall ecology of the early Cretaceous landscape. But they had an innovation: the flower. The flower is, when you think about it, one of the most elaborate structures in the biological world. It is essentially an advertisement, a landing platform, a reward system, and a precision delivery mechanism for genetic material, all combined in a single structure that must attract the right visitor at the right time, while discouraging those who would consume its pollen without facilitating fertilization. To produce a flower, you need a pollinator, and to sustain a pollinator, you need a flower. This is a co-evolutionary lock, and it is one of the most productive and generative relationships in the history of life. The insects that pollinated the early flowering plants were, in some cases, groups that already existed, opportunistically adapting to a new food source. But the explosive diversification of flowering plants through the Cretaceous drove an equally explosive diversification of insect pollinators, particularly bees, wasps, flies, and butterflies. By the late Cretaceous, approximately 90 to 66 million years ago, the flowering plants had spread from their marginal weedy origins to dominate many terrestrial ecosystems. The forests of the late Cretaceous were increasingly filled with familiar-seeming plants: fig relatives, magnolias, plane trees, early palms, not identical to modern species, but recognizable in their broad form. The dinosaurs moved through a world that was, in its floral dimension, beginning to look almost recognizable, and the insects that accompanied this floral explosion were producing things in the late Cretaceous that still exist today: amber, tree resin, produced by conifers and increasingly by early flowering plants, sometimes traps and preserves the small organisms that fall into it or are caught, against bark. When buried and subjected to geological pressure and chemistry over millions of years, resin polymerizes into amber, and within amber, the preservation is so extraordinary that it makes the bone-in-rock fossils of dinosaurs look impoverished by comparison. In Burmese amber, dated to approximately 99 million years ago in the mid-Cretaceous, researchers have found preserved insects with their structural colours still intact, spiders with silk-spinning organs still visible, feathers with melanosomes still distinguishable, a newly hatched bird chick from approximately 99 million years ago, preserved in amber with soft tissue and plumage, showing details of its anatomy that could never be recovered from bone alone. In one extraordinary specimen, a small fragment of dinosaur tail covered in feathers was found preserved in Cretaceous amber from Myanmar. Not a hint of a fossil, not an impression. The actual feathers, still soft-looking, still showing their branching structure, preserved in amber for approximately 99 million years. You could hold something like that in your hand. You could see it. The Cretaceous, which ended 66 million years ago, preserved in a golden window of tree resin, looking not like something impossibly ancient, but like something that happened this afternoon. I find that thought both wonderful and quietly vertiginous, the way certain truths are. There is also the story of the sea. The Mesozoic oceans were as extraordinary as the land, and because they fall outside the standard dinosaur narrative, they are often overlooked. But the Western Interior Seaway, which at various points in the Cretaceous divided North America into eastern and western land masses, was one of the most biologically productive marine environments in the history of the planet. Its surface waters swarmed with ammonites, those coiled cephalopods whose shells are among the most familiar fossils in the world, ranging from coin-sized to, in some species, over 2 meters in diameter. Beneath them, mosasaurs, enormous lizard relatives secondarily adapted to marine life, reached lengths of 17 meters or more, and were the apex predators of the Cretaceous seas. Plesiosaurs, though declining in the late Cretaceous, still patrolled the deeper waters with their long necks and paddled flipper propulsion. The sea floor of the Western Interior Seaway is now exposed as the Pierre Shale, across the plains of Kansas and the Dakotas, one of the richest marine fossil deposits in the world. In this rock, the shells of ammonites lie alongside the bones of mosasaurs, the teeth of ancient sharks, the remains of fish so well preserved that their scales still catch the light. The ancient sea, dried up 66 million years ago, left its record in the rock of a landscape that today is semi-arid grassland and farmland. The wheat fields of Kansas grow above the floor of an ocean, where monsters swam. That contrast, the ordinary, present, the extraordinary past, separated by nothing more than the depth of the rock, is one of the things I love most about geology. The strangeness is always just beneath you. I want to talk now about the decades before the end, not the day of the impact, which we will return to, but the long, quiet period of the final millions of years of the Cretaceous, the time that set the stage for what was coming, without knowing it was coming. Because the asteroid did not arrive into a world at the peak of its complexity and health. This is one of the things that Part 1 touched on, and that I want to explore more deeply tonight, because it changes the meaning of the extinction in ways I find genuinely important. The late Cretaceous, the final 15 to 20 million years before the KPE boundary, was a world dealing with change. The climate was shifting. The warm, ice-free greenhouse climate that had characterized most of the Mesozoic was giving way, slowly and irregularly, to something slightly cooler and more variable. Sea levels, which had been extraordinarily high during the mid-Cretaceous, flooding large portions of the continents, were falling. The shallow inland seas that had been critical habitats for many species were shrinking and in some cases disappearing. The Deccan Traps, the enormous volcanic province in what is today India, were erupting. Not all at once, not catastrophically, but persistently, releasing basaltic lava across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers and injecting sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere in quantities large enough to alter climate patterns, acidify rainfall, and affect ocean chemistry. The diversity of large herbivorous dinosaurs was declining, not dramatically, not obviously, from within the span of a human lifetime, but statistically, measurably. When you look at the fossil record across the final 10 million years of the Cretaceous, the number of distinct large herbivore species is smaller at the end than it was in the middle. The ecosystems were contracting slightly, species by species, the way a slow exhalation contracts the chest. Imagine an ecologist studying the wildlife of the late Cretaceous, 67 million years ago. She would have had no way of knowing that an extinction event was imminent. The world she was observing was still extraordinarily rich by any standard. Herds of hadrosaurs moving through the river valleys of western North America. Ceratopsians in diverse species arrays across the same region. Ankylosaurs, armoured and low-slung, moving through the underbrush. Tyrannosaurids and other large theropods at the top of the food chain. It was not a world on the obvious edge of collapse, but it was a world that had lost some of its resilience, some of its capacity to absorb and recover from perturbation. The ecological equivalent of a structure that has been slowly developing weaknesses, not visible on the surface, but present, waiting for the thing that would finally test them. And here is the piece of evidence that I find most quietly haunting. In the Hell Creek Formation, which preserves the very last 3 meters of Cretaceous sediment in the northern Great Plains of North America, the record of what those final years looked like has been studied with extraordinary precision. The Hell Creek Formation is the terrestrial equivalent of the KPG boundary layer. It contains the last dinosaurs, the last Cretaceous flora and fauna, and then, above a thin layer of clay enriched in iridium, the first Paleocene. In the uppermost Hell Creek, the diversity of large dinosaur species is reduced from what it was even 5 million years earlier. There are fewer species. The populations of those remaining may have been smaller. The ecosystems were thinner. And in the pollen record, preserved in the same sediments, there is evidence of ecological stress. Fern spores, which in modern ecosystems dramatically spike following any major disturbance, show elevated frequencies in the last million years of the Cretaceous, suggesting that plant communities were being repeatedly disrupted. The world was not well. It was carrying on. It was functioning. The dinosaurs in it were presumably going about the business of their lives with no awareness of any long-term trend. But in the sediment record, in the pollen, in the declining species counts, there is the geological equivalent of the subtle signs that something is wrong, a kind of slow distress signal embedded in the rock that only those millions of years removed from the event can read. I want you to hold that image for a moment. the last hadrosaurs grazing at dusk on the banks of a Cretaceous river, unaware that the world they lived in had been quietly weakening for millions of years. Unaware that 2 days before the end, the sun rose as it always had, and the food was as it always had been, and the sounds of the evening were as familiar as they had ever been. There is something in that, in the ordinariness of the ending, that I find more moving than the spectacle of the impact itself. The last morning was just a morning. Now I want to tell you something about the asteroid itself, because the asteroid is not just a rock, it is a piece of information, a message from the early solar system, preserved almost unchanged for 4.5 billion years, then travelling at 60,000 kilometers per hour through the atmosphere of a planet full of life. The object that struck the Yucatan Peninsula 66 million years ago was approximately 10 to 15 kilometers in diameter. This is difficult to visualize, so let me try. Imagine the distance between you and the center of the nearest city. 10 kilometers is roughly the distance across a metropolitan downtown. The asteroid was that wide. A city-sized rock, travelling at 17 times the speed of a bullet, entering an atmosphere that is, compared to its size, no more than a thin film, of moisture on the surface of a basketball. At the speed it was travelling, it would have crossed the entire thickness of the atmosphere, from the edge of space to the ground in roughly 2 seconds. There was no long, dramatic arc. There was no warning visible from the ground for more than a few seconds at most. Something in the sky, a brightness, and then the light of the impact, which would have been, near the impact site, brighter than the surface of the sun. The physics of what happened when it struck are in some respects beyond ordinary intuition. The rock of the Yucatan Peninsula, the target, is composed largely of limestone and evaporate minerals, rocks formed from the compression of ancient marine sediments rich in calcium carbonate and calcium sulfate. These are rocks that, under sufficient heat and pressure, release gases. Carbon dioxide from the limestone, sulfur dioxide and sulfur trioxide from the evaporites. The asteroid arrived with kinetic energy equivalent to approximately 100 million megatons of TNT. For comparison, the largest nuclear weapon ever detonated released energy equivalent to roughly 50 megatons. The Chicxulub impact was, in its energy release, about 2 million times more powerful than the largest nuclear weapon. That energy, deposited into the limestone platform over the course of approximately a second, did not simply dig a hole. It vaporized. It liquefied. It converted the impactor and a substantial volume of the target rock into a plasma, a superheated gas, expanding outward faster than the speed of sound. The crater as it now exists, buried beneath a kilometer of younger rock, and detected through gravity and seismic surveys, is approximately 150 kilometers across and roughly 20 kilometers deep at its center. The peak ring, the mountainous ring of uplifted rock at the center of the crater, formed within minutes as the rock that had been pushed downward by the impact rebounded upward like water splashing in reverse. Rocks from below the crater, from depths that under ordinary geological circumstances would be inaccessible, were flung upward and outward. Some of them travelled to the far side of the planet. Spherules of impact glass, formed when molten rock was thrown high into the atmosphere and rapidly cooled, have been found in Cretaceous sediments as far away as New Zealand. Within the first hour after the impact, ejecta raining back down from ballistic trajectories was setting forest fires across North America. The thermal pulse from re-entering material heated the atmosphere temporarily, globally, to temperatures that, in some models, were sufficient to cause ignition of dry vegetation at the surface across a significant fraction of the planet. The darkness came within days, as the injected sulfate aerosols and soot from global fires spread through the stratosphere. And here is the thing about the sulfur that I want you to hold carefully. The sulfur from the evaporites formed sulfuric acid aerosols in the stratosphere. These aerosols reflected sunlight, cooling the surface. They also combined with water vapor to form acid rain, which had significant effects on marine and freshwater ecosystems already stressed by the impact itself. But the sulfur aerosols also caused something else, the ozone layer. Ultraviolet radiation from the sun is absorbed by ozone in the stratosphere, preventing most of it from reaching the surface. Sulfate aerosols interact with ozone chemistry, reducing the concentration of stratospheric ozone. Following the Chicxulub impact, there is evidence in the fossil record of elevated mutation rates and developmental abnormalities in plant spores, exactly what you would expect if ultraviolet radiation was reaching the surface in elevated quantities. The impact did not just block the sunlight, it also, temporarily, altered the chemistry of the sky. The creatures in the last weeks and months of the Cretaceous were not simply living in the dark. They were living in a chemically altered atmosphere, under a sky that no longer filtered the radiation of the sun in the way they had evolved to tolerate. This is the scale of what the asteroid brought. And yet life survived. Not easily. Not without catastrophic loss. But some things found a way. In burrows, in the deep ocean below the affected surface waters, in seeds and spores and resting stages that could wait out the impossible winter, in the bodies of small, adaptable generalists who could eat almost anything and tolerate almost any temperature, and whose metabolisms could slow when times were hard. Life found a way. It always does. I find that more comforting than anything else in this story. Now, I promised you a twist within the twist. I have been building toward this for hours, and I want to take it slowly because it deserves that. You know the standard story. Asteroid strikes, impact winter, mass extinction. The dinosaurs, along with approximately 3/4 of all species on Earth, are eliminated. The mammals inherit the emptied world and eventually give rise to you. That story is true, as far as it goes. But there is a layer beneath it that only became visible with the development of high-precision radiometric dating techniques over the last 2 decades. A layer that changes the meaning of the extinction without changing the basic facts. Let me explain. When geologists wanted to date the Chicxulub impact, they used a technique called argon-argon dating, which measures the decay of radioactive argon isotopes in crystals that were melted by the impact and then cooled, resetting their isotopic clock. The precision of this technique has improved dramatically with modern instrumentation. The date they obtained for the Chicxulub impact is 66,043,000 years ago, plus or minus a margin of error of roughly 11,000 years. This is extraordinary precision for an event 66 million years in the past. Now, the Deccan Traps, the enormous volcanic province in India that was erupting throughout the late Cretaceous. What date does their main pulse of eruption occur at? When researchers applied the same argon-argon dating technique to the Deccan basalts, they found something that caused a considerable stir. The main pulse of Deccan eruption begins approximately 250,000 years before the Chicxulub impact and continues for approximately 500,000 years after it. These are not independent events separated by millions of years. They are events separated by a geological instant. They overlap, and there is more. When researchers looked at the rate of Deccan eruption more carefully, examining the thickness and composition of different lava flows and their isotopic ages, they found that the eruption rate was not constant throughout this period. Before the Chicxulub impact, a certain rate. After the Chicxulub impact substantially accelerated, the seismic energy released by the impact, travelling through the interior of the Earth, appears to have reached the Deccan plume, the deep anomaly in the mantle generating the volcanic activity, and destabilised it, triggered it, accelerated a process that was already underway. 2 extinction-level events, occurring simultaneously, and the larger of the two may have physically triggered an acceleration of the other. That is extraordinary. But the layer beneath it is this. If you take the Deccan eruption rate before the impact and model forward to what the climate would have looked like in the absence of the impact, just the volcanic activity, just the long, slow warming and acidification from the Deccan emissions, some models suggest that the ecosystem stress would have continued and worsened over the subsequent hundreds of thousands of years, potentially pushing many of the already stressed late Cretaceous ecosystems into a different kind of crisis. Not the sudden catastrophic extinction of the impact, but a slower, more drawn-out collapse, affecting different species in different ways, potentially producing a very different post-Cretaceous world. This means that even without the asteroid, the end of the Cretaceous might not have been the beginning of the age of mammals we know. The world we live in, the mammals, the primates, the humans, is not simply the result of an asteroid eliminating the competition. It is the result of a specific combination of events, a specific timing, a specific sequence that produced conditions uniquely favourable for the particular evolutionary experiments that led to here. If the asteroid had arrived a million years earlier, when the Deccan eruptions were less advanced and the dinosaur fauna was more diverse, the aftermath might have been different. If the asteroid had arrived a million years later, when the Deccan eruptions had already stressed the ecosystems further, the aftermath might have been different. If the asteroid had struck a different part of the Earth, with different geology, releasing less sulfur, the aftermath would almost certainly have been different. You're here because of a precise alignment of forces that had no reason to align precisely. The exact rock, the exact target, the exact timing, the exact chemistry. And from this precise alignment, you, all of you, everything you know and feel and remember and hope for, out of 66-million-year-old rock. I want you to let that settle into you very slowly. Let me tell you about the survivors. Not just that they survived, but how. Because the mechanisms of survival across the KPG boundary are themselves a story, full of contingency and accident, and the particular ways that different body plans and ecological strategies responded to a crisis unlike anything that had occurred in the previous 100 million years. The rule of thumb that emerges from the KPG extinction data is this: small body size was enormously protective. Animals weighing less than roughly 25 kilograms had significantly higher survival rates than animals above that threshold. This is not absolute. There are large-bodied marine species that survived and small-bodied terrestrial species that did not. But the trend is strong enough to be meaningful. Why? Because small animals eat less. Because small animals can exploit food sources that larger animals cannot. Because small animals in many cases have shorter generation times and can reproduce before starvation kills them. Because small animals can shelter in burrows or crevices or underwater in ways that provide some protection from the thermal pulse and the acid rain and the long darkness. The small, burrowing mammals of the late Cretaceous were not the apex of their ecosystem. They were the overlooked margins of it, the nocturnal edge cases, the generalist opportunists, the animals that ate whatever was available and lived in whatever shelter presented itself. They were, in other words, perfectly positioned for a crisis that destroyed everything specialized and large. But survival across the KPG boundary was not purely a matter of body size, it was also a matter of diet. Animals that were obligate consumers of specific living plants were devastated by the collapse of plant productivity during the impact winter. Specialized herbivores, the ceratopsians and hadrosaurs that depended on abundant fresh vegetation, starved as the light-blocking aerosols suppressed photosynthesis globally. Animals that could eat dead organic matter, seeds, insects, fungi, anything that did not depend on current photosynthesis, had a crucial advantage. The first months and years after the impact were dominated by a kind of ecological salvage economy, everything eating the remains of the world that had just ended. Seed caching behavior is one of the things that saved the lineages leading to modern songbirds. Seeds can remain viable for years without requiring active photosynthesis. A bird that eats seeds does not depend on the current growing season. In the darkness after the impact, the surviving ancestors of modern seed-eating birds were accessing stored energy that the impact could not touch. Similarly, the small mammals that survived were predominantly insectivores and omnivores. Insects, particularly decomposers feeding on the enormous quantities of dead organic matter produced by the impact, remained abundant even in the impact winter. Eating insects, you could make it through. In freshwater ecosystems, the survival pattern is different and equally instructive. Many freshwater fish survived because freshwater ecosystems are partially decoupled from atmospheric disturbance. The light that drives aquatic photosynthesis can be replaced temporarily by the decay of organic material falling into the water from the disturbed terrestrial environment. Detritivory, eating dead material, is an ancient and robust strategy. The turtles and crocodilians that survived were predominantly freshwater species with exactly this kind of dietary flexibility. Their marine counterparts, more specialized and more dependent on specific food chains, fared less well. And the birds. Of the many bird lineages present in the late Cretaceous, most did not survive the KPG boundary. The enantiornithines, which had been the dominant birds for most of the Cretaceous, and which were remarkable in their diversity and abundance, were almost completely eliminated. They had, apparently, the wrong combination of body size and dietary specialization. What survived were the ancestors of modern birds, the neornithines, which were at that moment a relatively minor, somewhat generalized group. Ground nesting, apparently, capable of sustained flight, with beaks adapted for processing hard food items like seeds. The neornithines were not the most impressive birds of the Cretaceous. They were not the most specialized or the most morphologically elaborate. They were, again, the overlooked, generalists, the adaptable edge cases, and from those edge cases, every bird alive today. The wandering albatross with its 3-metre wingspan, the emperor penguin standing motionless in a 70 below blizzard, the hummingbird hovering on a 2-gram body, its heart beating 1,200 times per minute, every parakeet, every sparrow, every flamingo standing in its pink-tinged flock on a shallow alkaline lake. All of them are the children of the survivors of the impossible winter. I find this thought genuinely astonishing. The albatross and the hummingbird and the penguin and you are all, in a very real sense, the consequence of that same event. The same rock, striking the same chemistry at the same moment. Everything after follows from that. I want to spend some time in the deep time between the KPG boundary and tonight. Not to race through it. Not to summarize it in the way a history textbook summarizes the intervening years between major events as if they were merely transition, but to actually inhabit it, at least for a moment, to feel the weight of 66 million years. The Paleocene epoch, the first geological period after the extinction, lasted approximately 10 million years. 10 million years of recovery. 10 million years of small mammals tentatively expanding into the empty niches. 10 million years of flowering plants diversifying and spreading. 10 million years of ocean ecosystems reconstituting from the few surviving lineages. 10 million years. If you compress that into 1 year, each day would represent 27,000 years. Modern human civilization, roughly 10,000 years old, would fit into less than 9 hours of that single day. The Paleocene is a world of small things. The largest mammals are roughly the size of pigs or large dogs. The ecological pyramid, stripped of its apex by the extinction, is being rebuilt from the bottom up. And then the Eocene, beginning 56 million years ago. The Eocene is warm, extraordinarily warm, in the early part of the epoch, a brief period called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, in which global temperatures rose by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius, above even the already warm baseline, triggered by a massive release of carbon into the atmosphere from unknown sources, possibly methane hydrates on the ocean floor or a large igneous event. The Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum lasted approximately 200,000 years. During this period, tropical forests extended to the polar regions. The Arctic Ocean was warm enough, temporarily, to support subtropical species, and in this extraordinary heat, the diversification of mammals accelerated dramatically. The first recognizable ancestors of most modern mammal groups appear in the early Eocene, the ancestors of the horses, artiodactyls, rodents, lagomorphs. The first bats appear in the Eocene, already essentially modern in their wing and echolocation anatomy, and quietly in the tropical forests of what is today Africa and Asia, the first primates. Primates are, in the fossil record, a relatively unremarkable group in their early history. Small, arboreal, frugivorous, distinguished by their forward-facing eyes, their grasping hands, and a slightly expanded brain case relative to their nearest relatives. They are not obviously special, but the forward-facing eyes, producing the binocular stereoscopic vision required for judging distances precisely in three-dimensional space, are a pre-adaptation. An evolutionary preparation for something that the Eocene primates cannot anticipate. The selective pressure that will eventually favour larger and larger brains in certain lineages. The social complexity that will drive the evolution of language. The language that will eventually allow one particular species of primate to lie in a warm, safe place and understand, at least partially, the 66 million years of history that preceded its existence. The Eocene is followed by the Oligocene, and the Oligocene by the Miocene. The Miocene, beginning about 23 million years ago, is the age of grasslands. For most of the history of life on Earth, grass was absent. The low, mat-forming plants that now cover vast swathes of every continent are a relatively recent innovation, and the ecosystems built around them, the great savannas and steppes and prairies, are a Miocene and later invention. Grass, with its silica-reinforced cells and its growth from the base rather than the tip, allowing it to survive grazing, transformed the ecology of open habitats. The ungulates, the hoofed mammals that had been evolving in forested and woodland environments, suddenly had access to an enormous new resource, the carbon stored in the rapidly spreading grass. The response was an evolutionary explosion of grazing species, of the horses and the bovines and the antelopes, adapting high-crowned teeth and efficient digestive systems for processing a food source that had not previously existed in any significant quantity. And in the forests of Africa, the primates were diversifying. The great apes appear in the Miocene, large-bodied, relatively brainy, with longer life histories and more complex social structures than their smaller primate relatives. Most Miocene ape lineages did not survive into the present. The world of the middle to late Miocene was rich in ape diversity in a way that the modern world is not. A paleontologist studying the Miocene would have found it unremarkable that apes were common. They were, in their time, the successful family. But the cooling of the late Miocene and the continued spread of grasslands at the expense of forests put pressure on forest-dependent ape lineages. Most contracted or went extinct. A few survived in the remaining forest refugia, and one, in eastern Africa, in the increasingly fragmented forests at the edge of the expanding Rift Valley grasslands, found a different solution. Began to walk, we have come again to the present, or near enough to it. The full arc of it, from Pangaea to you, from the first uncertain dinosaurs of the Triassic to the last of them standing in the impact winter, from the small survivors in their burrows to the Eocene forests, to the Miocene savannas, to the upright, large-brained primate lying here in the dark. That arc is too large for any single telling. We have taken a long path through some of its chambers tonight, and I hope the path has left you feeling something useful, something that makes the present feel differently weighted. Here is what I find most important about the story we have told together. It is not a story of inevitable progress. It is not a story that was moving, from the beginning, toward the production of human beings as its predetermined destination. The thread that leads from the Cretaceous to you passes through dozens of moments that could have gone differently. The specific asteroid, with its specific chemistry striking the specific Yucatan, geology, at the specific moment when the Deccan eruptions were already stressing the system. The specific surviving lineages, with their specific dietary flexibility, in their specific ecological positions. The specific primate that began to walk upright in the specific fragmented forest of the specific Rift Valley. Any of these contingencies reversed, and the story is different, perhaps radically different. You are not the inevitable outcome of the history of the Earth. You are an improbable one, and improbability, when you look at it clearly, is not a reason for anxiety. It is a reason for a particular kind of wonder, the feeling of standing at the end of a long sequence of accidents and recognizing that the sequence produced you, that could not have been predicted from any of its individual components. The meteor that ended the dinosaurs was not aimed at producing mammals. The mammals that survived were not aiming to produce primates. The primates that walked upright were not aiming to produce human beings. Each step was blind, contingent, shaped by forces that had no interest in the outcome. And yet here is the outcome. Here you are, aware of the whole sequence, or at least of a meaningful fraction of it, able to hold it in your mind, able to feel something about it, wonder or grief or peace or curiosity, or all of these at once. That capacity, the capacity to know the story you are part of, is the latest and strangest development in a story that began 66 million years ago with a rock in space and a world full of creatures who had no language and left no record of what they knew. They knew the texture of the morning, the sound of the herd, the specific quality of light through the canopy of a Cretaceous forest. They knew, in whatever way a nervous system can know things without language, the feel of the world they lived in. They did not know it was going to end. We know ours will, eventually, in some form. We live in the awareness of our own contingency in a way that no animal before us could have. We know about the asteroid. We know about the geological record. We know about the long line of extinctions and survivals and recoveries that led to us, and that will continue after us, for as long as the Earth continues to turn. And somehow, knowing all of that, we still lie down at night. We still let our breathing slow. We still let the day go, because the Earth is still here. The rock is still turning, 4.5 billion years old, cooling very slowly from the interior, its surface covered in the remarkable thin film of living complexity that has persisted through 5 major extinctions and countless smaller ones. The record is still being written. You're still in it. And tonight, in whatever warm and quiet place you have found, you're doing something that no other moment in the 66 million year story we have told tonight was able to do. You are resting, aware of the whole thing, held, by it rather than frightened of it, part of the long continuation. The asteroid came and went. The impact winter ended. The survivors found the sunlight. And 66 million years later, their descendant is here, in the dark, drifting slowly towards sleep, held by the oldest planet she has ever known. Let the images drift now, the hadrosaurs calling across the floodplain, the iridescent black feathers catching the last Cretaceous light, the small mammals in their burrows, waiting, the patient rebuilding, all of it receding gently into the soft formlessness of almost sleep. The Earth is very old, you're very new. Both of these things are wonderful. Rest now. Sleep. Did you watch part 1? Let us know your favourite moment from the series in the comments, and subscribe to travel through time with us again. The Earth is still turning, slowly, patiently, as it always has. You are safe. You are here. Sleep. Where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this.